Nick Chambers had never been one to seek attention. He simply believed in doing his job, protecting his community, upholding the law, and ensuring fairness for all. For 15 years, he had served as a sheriff, navigating the highs and lows of law enforcement with unwavering integrity. His name was known across town, not just because of his uniform, but because of his character. He was the type of man who would stop to help a stranded motorist, buy lunch for a struggling family, or volunteer at the youth center on his rare days off. Most people appreciated Nick's efforts, treating him with respect both in and out of uniform. But one person in particular had always seemed to despise him, Karen Greenlaw, his next-door neighbor. Karen had lived in the neighborhood longer than Nick, and from the moment he moved in, she made it clear she had a problem with him. It started with small things, ignoring his greetings, slamming her door when he arrived home, or making snide remarks just loud enough for him to hear. Over time, her hostility became more overt. She complained about his car being parked too close to her driveway, even though it never was. She called the HOA on him for violating neighborhood policies, only for them to find no wrongdoing on his part. Nick had no idea why she hated him so much, but he never let it bother him. He had arrested plenty of aggressive, angry individuals in his career, so a bitter neighbor wasn't going to shake him. As long as she stayed out of his way, he was content to ignore her. That all changed one fateful evening. After an exhausting 12-hour shift, all Nick wanted was to unwind with his wife and 2 kids. He had been on his feet all day, responding to calls, mediating disputes, and handling paperwork that never seemed to end. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he exhaled a breath of relief, grateful to be home. Before heading inside, he needed to take out the trash. A simple task, something he had done countless times before without incident. But tonight, it would be different. Nick grabbed the trash bag from the kitchen, tying it tightly before stepping out the back door. The cool evening air was refreshing against his skin, a welcome contrast to the stifling heat of the patrol car he had spent most of the day in. Still in uniform, he made his way toward the curb, mind already drifting to what his wife had cooked for dinner. That's when he heard the door next to his swing open. The sound was sharp, almost aggressive, as if someone had thrown it open with force. He turned just in time to see Karen marching toward him, her face contorted with anger. "You can't take that trash out," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet neighborhood like a siren. Nick paused, blinking at her in confusion. "Excuse me?" Karen stopped a few feet away from him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I said you can't take that trash out. Who do you think you are?" Nick tilted his head slightly, trying to make sense of what she was saying. This was new, even for her. "Ma'am, I live here. I take out my trash every day. What's the problem?" Karen's expression twisted further, as if his response had only fueled her anger. "You walk around here like you own this place. Like you're in charge of everything just because you wear that badge." Nick sighed internally. He had dealt with plenty of irrational people in his career, but this was something else. This wasn't about the trash. This was about something deeper, something ugly. "Karen," he said evenly, keeping his voice calm, "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm taking out my trash like I always do, and then I'm going inside. Let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be." But Karen wasn't interested in de-escalation. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. "No. I'm sick of this. I'm sick of you walking around like you own the place, like you're better than everyone else." Nick's patience was wearing thin, but he refused to let her get under his skin. "Karen, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not going to argue. If you have an issue, you can take it up with the HOA or the city. But I am not." Before he could finish, Karen did something that made the entire world slow down. She spat on him. A thick glob of saliva landed on his uniform, just above his badge. For a moment, Nick didn't move. The act was so brazen, so vile, that his brain needed a second to process it. He had dealt with spitters before, drunk suspects, angry criminals, but never in his own front yard, never from a neighbor, never from someone who had no reason to hate him other than the color of his skin. A fire ignited in his chest, but he pushed it down. Reacting with anger would only escalate the situation. He had too much to lose, too much at stake. "Karen," he said slowly, his voice laced with warning. "Step back." But she didn't step back. She lunged. Her hands reached for him, her face twisted in a mix of rage and something almost desperate. Nick moved on instinct, sidestepping her attack and grabbing her wrists before she could do any damage. "Ma'am, you're assaulting an officer," he said firmly. "I need you to stop resisting." Karen thrashed, screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs. Neighbors were starting to come outside, watching in shock. Nick had no choice. He spun Karen around, securing her arms behind her back with the smooth efficiency of years on the job. "You're under arrest for assault and disorderly conduct," he said, reaching for his radio to call for backup. Karen's screams filled the night, but Nick felt nothing but exhaustion. He had just wanted to take out the trash. Now, he was dealing with something much bigger. And deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Karen Greenlaw was no stranger to making a scene, but this time, she had gone too far. Nick had dealt with plenty of disorderly individuals during his career, but never had he imagined he'd have to restrain his own neighbor in front of his home. As she flailed in his grip, her shrieks tore through the quiet evening air. "Get off me. You have no right to touch me. This is my neighborhood, not yours." Nick tightened his hold just enough to keep her from breaking free but not enough to hurt her. "Karen, stop resisting," he said in a firm but controlled voice. "You just assaulted an officer. This is only getting worse for you." "I don't care," she spat, quite literally, as another glob of spit flew toward his face. This time, he turned his head just in time for it to miss. By now, porch lights were flickering on across the street. Neighbors were stepping out, watching in stunned silence. Some held their phones up, recording the altercation. Nick heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. Thank God. The last thing he wanted was for someone to twist this into something it wasn't. He knew how these situations could be spun out of context. He wasn't about to let Karen turn herself into some kind of victim. 2 patrol cars pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the surrounding houses. Officers stepped out, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Deputy Owens, a younger officer who had always admired Nick, approached cautiously. "Sheriff Chambers?" he asked, almost uncertainly. Nick exhaled. "Owens, take her in. She spit on me, then tried to attack me." Karen screamed again, thrashing. "This is police brutality. This is racist. You can't do this to me." Owens hesitated for a second, then looked at the gathered neighbors. Most of them were shaking their heads in disbelief at Karen's wild accusations. One older woman, Mrs. Caldwell, crossed her arms. "Karen, everyone saw what you did. You attacked him." Owens nodded, regaining his composure. "All right, ma'am. You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and disorderly conduct." Karen's shrieks became incoherent as Owens and another officer placed her in cuffs and led her toward the patrol car. "This isn't over," she screamed as they shut the door behind her. Nick sighed, rubbing his temples. He could already feel the headache forming. Owens walked back over. "You good, sir?" Nick gave a small nod. "Yeah. Just tired." Owens gave him a sympathetic look. "We'll take care of the processing. You should get some rest." Nick appreciated the sentiment, but he had a nagging feeling this wasn't going to be the end of it. And he was right. The next morning, Nick walked into the sheriff's department feeling the weight of the previous night still lingering on his shoulders. He hadn't even had a chance to explain the situation to his wife and kids properly. Now, he had to deal with the fallout. Karen had been booked for assault and disorderly conduct, but something about her behavior still didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the attack itself, it was the way she had spoken, the way she had looked at him with so much seething hatred. Deputy Owens met him at his office door, holding a manila folder. His face was serious. "Sir, I ran a background check on Karen Greenlaw like you asked." Nick took the folder and opened it, scanning the information inside. What he saw made his stomach turn. Karen Greenlaw had a past. A dark one. She had once been affiliated with a known hate group. In her younger years, she had been an active member of a local white supremacist organization. Though she had no criminal record, there were reports of her being involved in protests and intimidation tactics against black families moving into certain neighborhoods decades ago. The group she had been linked to. A chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Nick let out a slow breath. He had known her hostility wasn't random, but seeing it confirmed in black and white was still jarring. This wasn't just about a bitter old woman with a bad temper. This was about deep-seated racism that had festered for years, boiling over into an unprovoked attack. Owens shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I also checked her social media. It's bad. She's posted a lot of stuff about how law enforcement has been taken over, and how this country isn't what it used to be." Nick closed the folder, pressing his fingers against his temples. He had dealt with racism before, but it never got easier. And it never made sense. "We're keeping her in holding until her court hearing," Owens continued. "DA says she's looking at least a year in jail. Maybe more, since it was an attack on an officer." Nick nodded. "Good. She needs to face the consequences." Owens hesitated. "There's one more thing." Nick looked up. Owens handed him a tablet. Local news picked it up. Someone posted a video of the incident. "It's going viral." Nick took the tablet and pressed play. The footage showed everything: Karen yelling, spitting, attacking him. It was impossible to misinterpret. The comment section was already flooded with reactions, most of them condemning Karen's actions. Nick set the tablet down. He knew this would only grow from here. People would debate, argue, make assumptions. But the truth was clear: Karen had attacked him for no other reason than hatred. And now, she was finally facing the consequences. Nick took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't looking for a fight. He never had been. But if standing his ground meant exposing the ugly reality of racism in his community, then so be it. Because justice wasn't just something he upheld in uniform. It was something he believed in, every single day. The days following Karen Greenlaw's arrest were nothing short of chaotic. The video of her attack on Nick had spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, local activists demanded justice, and social media exploded with debates. Some people were outraged, condemning Karen's blatant racism and praising Nick for his restraint. Others, though a much smaller group, tried to defend her, claiming she was just an old woman having a bad day, or that she was being treated unfairly. Nick ignored the noise. He had a job to do. When the official charges were filed, assault on an officer, disorderly conduct, and harassment, Karen's legal team immediately tried to spin the narrative. They claimed she had a history of mental distress and that her actions were the result of confusion and fear. But the video evidence spoke louder than any excuse they could make. The court date arrived quickly. Nick sat in the courtroom, watching as Karen was led to the defense table. She looked different. The arrogance and rage that had fueled her attack were gone. Instead, she appeared tired, small, and defeated. The prosecution laid everything out: her attack, her past affiliations, her long-standing hostility toward Nick. They even presented additional testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed her behavior over the years. It wasn't just about what she had done to Nick that night, it was about a pattern of hate that had finally reached its breaking point. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she didn't offer an apology. She didn't show remorse. Instead, she doubled down. "I was defending myself," she claimed. "That man has always been a problem in this neighborhood. I was just standing my ground." The courtroom murmured in disbelief. Even her own attorney seemed exasperated. Nick watched, unimpressed. He had seen this kind of deflection before, people so deep in their own hatred that they couldn't even admit when they were wrong. The judge wasn't having it. After a brief deliberation, the verdict was handed down, guilty. Karen Greenlaw was sentenced to 1 year in jail, 250 hours of community service upon release, and mandatory racial sensitivity training. The judge made it clear that her actions had consequences and that hate, in any form, had no place in their community. Nick exhaled as he left the courthouse. Justice had been served. But even as Karen was led away, he knew this wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger. In the weeks following the trial, the tension in the neighborhood began to fade. Without Karen's presence, the air felt lighter. People who had once stayed silent about her behavior now felt more comfortable speaking up, sharing their own experiences of her hostility. Nick wasn't one to celebrate someone else's downfall, but he couldn't deny the sense of relief he felt. Not just for himself, but for his family in his community. One afternoon, he was outside, this time grilling burgers instead of taking out the trash, when he noticed Mrs. Caldwell, his elderly neighbor, approaching with a warm smile. The world wasn't perfect. Racism still existed, and there would always be people like Karen Greenlaw who refused to change. But that night had proven something important: hate could be confronted. It could be exposed. And most importantly, it could be defeated. Later that evening, as he sat with his wife and kids, he felt a sense of peace.